On the afternoon of August 6, 1981, at approximately 2:17 p.m., a cashier at a small office supply store in Arlington, Virginia did something so ordinary it barely registered in her mind. She picked up a torn receipt that a customer had left on the counter and slipped it into the pocket of her apron, intending to throw it away later. People scribbled nonsense on receipts all the time. She slipped the scrap into her apron pocket, intending to throw it away later, and went back to the register. The incident would have disappeared into the blur of small retail moments if it had happened only once. But 3 weeks later, on August 27th, nearly the same sequence unfolded again. Again, the margin contained ink that did not belong there, a series of numbers and letters written in a small, precise hand. The style looked identical to what she vaguely remembered from 3 weeks earlier. This time, she didn't shrug. She slid the receipt into her apron pocket and, on her break, pulled out the first scrap she had never bothered to throw away. She forced herself to wait, to straighten one more row of highlighters, to let another customer pass. After 30 seconds, she stepped over, picked up the folded receipt, and slid it into her apron. 2 minutes later, the door chimed again. The younger man, the one with the badge, walked in carrying his usual manila folder. The receptionist transferred her to an agent, and Karen repeated her story. The men, the timing, the torn receipts, the coded margins. There was a pause on the other end of the line. The agent asked calm, methodical questions. Dates, times, physical descriptions, patterns. When Karen mentioned that she still had the receipts, the tone shifted almost imperceptibly. The agent asked if she would be willing to bring them in. By the end of the week, the Arlington office supply store that had seemed so ordinary was now considered a potential signaling site in an active espionage operation. A small task force was assembled under the authority of Special Agent Reeves, who had experience in counterintelligence cases involving suspected Soviet activity. The agents outside recorded the younger man's license plate as he later left and got into a faded blue sedan parked half a block away. Over the next several days, surveillance shifted focus. The car's plate was traced to Daniel Harris, a 37-year-old systems engineer employed by a defense contractor in Falls Church that held classified contracts with the Department of Defense. The warrants were executed at dawn on November 3rd. Harris was taken into custody in the parking lot of his apartment complex as he walked toward his car, briefcase in hand. He seemed more stunned than angry, repeating that there must be some mistake even as agents read him his rights and guided him into the back of an unmarked sedan. He described how he had been approached at a technology conference in D.C. by a man who later introduced himself as Oleg, claiming to represent an international research consortium interested in telecommunications. The initial contact had seemed harmless. Conversations about technical papers, shared frustration over bureaucracy, vague ideological talk about information wanting to be free. He would make a small purchase, accept his receipt, and then write a short string of code groups in the margin information that signaled whether a dead drop would be ready, how large the package would be, which location to use along a prearranged list. He would tear the receipt in half, keep the top portion, and leave the bottom half in a specific place inside the store. Harris stepped aside, wrote a prearranged sequence of code groups in the margin signals, indicating that new material was ready at a specific dead drop location, and left the bottom half of the receipt on the designated shelf near the door. Then he walked out, followed at a distance by agents who would ensure he made no unauthorized contact. Ultimately, Harris was charged under multiple provisions of Title 18 of the United States Code relating to the unauthorized transmission of national defense information to a foreign power. After weeks of negotiation between his attorney and federal prosecutors, he entered a guilty plea, citing financial pressure and manipulation as mitigating factors. The operation did not end because of sophisticated intercepts, exotic surveillance technology, or dramatic confrontations in dark alleys. It ended because one person noticed a pattern where others saw nothing, a torn receipt that appeared too often, in the same place, at the same time. In the shadow of the Cold War, where satellites and missiles commanded headlines, it was a small, disposable piece of paper that unraveled a secret channel between an American engineer and the intelligence service of a hostile power. Within weeks, that trivial scrap of paper would become the first visible thread of a hidden Soviet spy network, operating less than 3 miles from the Pentagon. The store was called Metro Stationers and Print, a narrow, fluorescent-lit space wedged between a laundromat and a dry cleaner on South Glebe Road. Karen watched him step away from the counter, pause at a small round display table near the door, and then leave. Less than 5 minutes later, the second man entered. He was younger, late 30s, with dark hair, a heavier build, and a tired, distracted expression. He wore a short-sleeved dress shirt with a badge clipped to his belt, the kind of generic ID used in office buildings across Northern Virginia. Side by side, the similarities were undeniable. Same paper, same store, same type of handwriting, same partial totals, same time window in the afternoon. That night, Karen mentioned it to her older brother, Mark, a former Army enlisted man now working night security at an office building in Crystal City. She described the two men, the timing, the torn receipts, the strange strings of letters and numbers. He glanced toward the front of the store, then moved directly to the shelf where the memo pads were stacked. His hand brushed along the edge of the shelf as if steadying himself, and the folded receipt disappeared into his palm almost without pause. He continued walking toward the back as though nothing had happened. Karen felt the bottom of her stomach drop. This was not coincidence. An appointment was scheduled for the following Monday morning. Karen hung up, shaking slightly, wondering if she had just made a mistake or if she had done the only responsible thing. On September 14th, Karen arrived at the field office with the 3 receipts sealed in a small envelope. She was greeted by 2 agents, Special Agent Thomas Reeves, mid-40s, reserved, and Special Agent Linda Myers, a decade younger, sharper around the edges. Undercover agents rotated through the store, posing as customers, browsing office furniture, studying calculators, pretending to compare paper types at the copy counter. Others sat in vehicles across the street, watching the entrance, noting license plates and arrival times. For the first week, nothing unusual happened. The store's regular rhythm returned. Secretaries buying staples, students copying term papers, sales reps grabbing notepads. He paid cash, left no obvious trace, and appeared only for brief windows of time. Over the next 3 weeks, the pattern repeated twice more. Each time, the older man arrived first, made a small purchase, left a marked receipt, and departed. Each time, Harris followed minutes later, collected the folded paper, and left the store after a brief, almost perfunctory stop at the copy counter. For the first few hours, he said little beyond, insisting on his innocence and requesting an attorney. He denied knowing anything about the older man, claimed the receipts were meaningless, and said he had never passed classified information to anyone. As the day wore on and the physical evidence was laid out in front of him, photographs of the receipts, images of the camera and cash, notes from his desk, his resolve began to crack. Oleg had explained the logic. Harris would buy supplies or make copies at Metro Stationers, a place frequented by hundreds of office workers every week. Receipts were everywhere, on counters, in trash cans, crumpled in pockets. No one looked twice at a scrap of thermal paper sitting on a shelf. On Wednesdays, if Harris had new photographs or notes ready, he would visit the store between 2 and 2:30 p.m. Agents prepared a set of false technical documents, carefully crafted forgeries that resembled legitimate classified materials but contained outdated or misleading information. On December 9th, 1981, following the old pattern, Harris visited Metro Stationers around 2:15 p.m. An undercover agent shadowed him as he purchased a pack of envelopes and accepted his receipt. Analysts combed through Harris' work history, matching the kinds of documents he had accessed to intelligence assessments of Soviet capabilities. While some damage could never be fully quantified, it was clear that information he had passed had contributed to closing gaps in Soviet understanding of American communication and satellite systems. For Karen, the store eventually became something she spoke about quietly and rarely. She finished her accounting degree, moved to a different city, and built a life far from the narrow aisles and humming copy machines of her early 20s. But she never entirely forgot the day she watched a man pick up a folded scrap of paper from a low shelf and walk away. Its customer base was a predictable mix: government secretaries buying folders, defense contractors picking up bulk copy jobs, and office workers grabbing pens on their lunch break. On most days, the rhythm never changed: ring up purchase, tear receipt, say next. The cashier's name was Karen Douglas, a 4-year-old part-time community college student studying accounting. She had been working at Metro Stationers for just over 18 months. The door chimed, and the second man, the heavier one, with the clipped-on badge, entered carrying a manila folder. He went straight to the copy machines in the back, spoke briefly with the copy clerk, and set his folder on the counter. Karen felt something tug at the back of her attention. The timing, the ages, the sense that she'd watched this before. She glanced at the display table near the door. She decided that if it happened a third time, she would not ignore it. The opportunity came sooner than she expected. On September 10th, 1981, shortly after 2:15 p.m., the older man returned. He purchased a set of report covers and a box of paper clips, paid cash again, and accepted his receipt. Karen felt her pulse quicken as she handed over the small strip of paper, watching his hands, and in the margins, dense strings of letters and numbers, groups of 5, separated by slashes or small dots. Karen wasn't an expert, but she was not naive. She had read enough and heard enough to recognize what they resembled: code groups, the kind used to disguise information in a way that looked meaningless to anyone who wasn't in on the system. He examined each receipt under the overhead light, then passed them to Myers. Both agents took noticeably longer looking at the margins than at the printed totals. Reeves asked if the same clerk had rung up all 3 purchases. Karen confirmed that she had. He asked if she could estimate the times based on the store's traffic patterns. She said they were all between 2 and 2:30 p.m. on weekdays. Karen worked her shifts, trying to act normal, forcing herself not to stare at every middle-aged man who bought pens. On October 1st, that changed. Shortly after 2:10 p.m., the slimmer man with wire-rimmed glasses walked in. He bought a single legal pad and a box of paper clips, paid cash, and received his receipt from Karen with a faint, polite smile that never reached his eyes. Agents followed Harris back to his apartment complex in Alexandria, documenting his routines: leaving for work, returning in the evening, occasional trips to the grocery store, a bar he frequented on Fridays. They observed no obvious meetings, no clandestine handoffs in parking lots, no nighttime walks to suspicious locations. The decision point came in late October. Reeves knew from experience that espionage cases could collapse if they waited too long. After consulting with a court-appointed attorney and being briefed on the potential sentences for espionage-related offenses, Harris agreed to cooperate in exchange for the possibility of a reduced sentence. What he told investigators over the next several days filled in the missing pieces and confirmed their worst suspicions. Harris admitted that he had been photographing sensitive materials for nearly 2.5 years, beginning in early 1979. Oleg, or another operative, would enter within a 15-minute window, retrieve the receipt, and know whether and where to pick up the actual material later, usually from a hollowed-out fence post or a magnetic container hidden under a specific bench along the commuter bus route. The beauty of the system, Oleg had boasted, was that no one ever saw them together in a suspicious context. Inside the store, 2 undercover agents browsed the aisles, eyes flicking from customers to the exposed scrap of paper. Outside, more agents watched from parked cars, radios active, ready to react the moment anyone retrieved the receipt. Minutes ticked by. Customers came and went. Secretaries picking up staples, a courier dropping off a copy job, a student buying notebooks. At his sentencing hearing in June 1982, his attorney argued that Harris had cooperated fully after his arrest, that he had helped dismantle a functioning espionage channel, and that he had shown genuine remorse. Prosecutors countered that his cooperation had arrived only after overwhelming evidence was presented, that his actions had spanned years and multiple payments, and that his assistance had failed to produce the one result that mattered most: identification of Oleg, or confirmation of his role in the broader Soviet network. Her duties were simple: run the register, stock shelves, straighten the magazine rack, and occasionally help at the small copy counter in the back, where customers printed resumes, reports, and presentations. Karen was observant in the quiet, practical way of someone who spent hours watching people move through the same small space. He went directly to the copy counter in the back with a manila folder under his arm. Karen rang up another customer and forgot about the first man. When she had a moment, she walked around the front of the store, straightening the impulse buy display near the door. That was when she saw it: a torn receipt, folded in half, sitting on the edge of the display table where the first man had paused. If they were real spies, they wouldn't be sloppy enough to use a receipt where anyone could see it. They joked about Soviet agents using staplers and printer paper as tradecraft. The conversation moved on, but when Karen went to bed that night, she found herself replaying the sequence in her mind: the older man, the brief pause, the younger man, the manila folder, the matching scraps of paper. This was not forgetfulness. This was a pass. For the rest of her shift, Karen's nerves hummed with a tight, electric anxiety. She waited until the store was quieter, then stepped into the tiny back office and unfolded all 3 receipts she had collected. Each one bore the same characteristics: bottom half only, afternoon timestamps, totals in roughly the same range. They led her into a small interview room, offered coffee, she declined, and asked her to tell the story again from the beginning. As she spoke, they took notes, occasionally asking for clarifications: distances inside the store, how often the men had appeared, whether anyone else had noticed. When she placed the envelope on the table, Reeves opened it with deliberate care. The mission was straightforward but delicate: confirm whether the site was being used for espionage, identify the participants, and gather enough evidence to support prosecution, all without spooking the network into disappearing. Surveillance began on September 24th, timed to coincide with the pattern Karen had described: weekday afternoons, roughly between 2 and 3 p.m. Harris had held a secret clearance for years, granting him access to technical materials related to communication systems and satellite control hardware. His personnel file showed no obvious problems: no recorded financial troubles, no disciplinary issues, no failed security reviews. On paper, he was exactly the sort of mid-level professional the national security apparatus depended on. The older man remained unidentified. In the kitchen, taped to the underside of a drawer, they found an envelope containing just over $6,000 in cash, all in carefully bundled $100 bills. There was no immediate explanation for the money in Harris' bank statements or salary history. Back at the field office, Harris was placed in an interrogation room. Over several months, those meetings shifted from conference coffee breaks to quiet bar tables and walks in crowded neighborhoods. Eventually, Oleg had made a more explicit proposal. He suggested that some of the information Harris had access to: technical specifications, system architecture details, performance data, should not be restricted to a single government. He framed it as a way of preventing imbalance, of ensuring that no one side possessed overwhelming advantage. All of their direct interactions took place in public spaces, bars, cafes, crowded sidewalks, and after the torn receipt system was established, face-to-face meetings had become rare. Signals and dead drops had replaced conversation. The FBI cross-checked Harris' description against their files of known and suspected Soviet intelligence officers operating under diplomatic and non-diplomatic cover. Several people brushed past the shelf, glancing briefly at the folded scrap of paper and ignoring it completely. 10 minutes passed. Then 15. At 20, Reeves, listening to the radio traffic from a vehicle down the block, began to accept what the pattern suggested. No one came for the receipt. The operation continued for several more weeks. The judge reviewed the arguments, the classified damage assessments, and the timeline of Harris' cooperation. He noted that while remorse might be present now, the decisions that led to this moment had been deliberate, repeated, and well compensated. Daniel Harris was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison, with the possibility of parole contingent on continued cooperation and future usefulness to counterintelligence efforts. She noticed regulars, remembered who always paid in cash, who liked blue ink instead of black, who came in only on Fridays to run off stacks of documents. It wasn't training or suspicion. It was simply what happened when you stood behind a counter long enough. On that afternoon in August, two men came into the store within minutes of each other. Around 2 p.m., the slimmer man with glasses walked in, purchased a notepad and pens, and stepped aside from the counter. He lingered near the display table by the door, pretending to scan a carousel of greeting cards. Karen rang him up, gave him his change and receipt, and turned to the next customer. 4 or 5 minutes passed. She ended the story with a nervous laugh, trying to make it sound like a curiosity rather than a worry. Mark listened and snorted. "Maybe you're watching too many spy movies," he said. "Guys leave weird notes in stores all the time. Could be anything, fantasy football, code for an affair, whatever." He stepped aside from the counter and wandered toward the display near the door. This time, Karen found a reason to leave the register. She called the copy clerk forward to cover for a moment, picked up a pack of highlighters, and pretended to rearrange a shelf close enough that she could see him in her peripheral vision. She sat for several minutes, staring at the paper. Calling the police over scrap receipts felt absurd. Calling federal authorities felt arrogant, like something out of a TV movie. But the image of the second man's practiced movement, the casual sweep of his hand as he picked up the folded receipt, would not leave her mind. The receipts were logged as evidence and sent to be examined by analysts who specialized in coded communications and tradecraft patterns. Karen was thanked, reminded not to discuss what she'd seen with anyone outside law enforcement, and told that someone would be in touch if they needed additional information. She left the building feeling both foolish and relieved, unsure which emotion would win. The analysis took only a few days. As he stepped aside from the counter, one of the undercover agents browsing near the pen display shifted slightly to get a better angle. The man paused near the same low shelf Karen had described, took a pen from his pocket, and wrote briefly on the receipt. He folded it, set it on the corner of the shelf, and walked out. If Harris sensed surveillance, or if his handler grew cautious, they could change locations, abandon the receipt system, or cut ties entirely. At the same time, moving too early risked having too little evidence to withstand scrutiny in court. On October 29, 1981, after the fourth documented receipt pass, and with enough circumstantial evidence to suggest ongoing espionage, Reeves authorized the next step, a coordinated arrest and search operation targeting Daniel Harris. When ideological appeals to global stability failed to fully convince Harris, Oleg had shifted tactics. He asked about Harris' life, his mortgage, his wife's medical bills, his student loans. He pointed out the strain of living near Washington on a mid-level engineer's salary. Money entered the conversation. The first payment had been small. $400 slipped into an envelope after Harris provided what he now claimed were non-critical documents. They could pass within feet of each other, and appear to be nothing more than strangers shopping for pens. After his arrest, Harris provided detailed descriptions of Oleg. Mid-40s, average height, light brown hair, a faint accent that he thought might be Russian or Baltic, the tendency to blend in rather than stand out. He claimed he never knew Oleg's real last name, place of residence, or cover occupation. In the following months, Harris sat for multiple debriefings with both FBI and CIA counterintelligence specialists. They pressed for any overlooked detail about Oleg, habitual phrases, favorite bars, specific meeting places that might tie him to other investigations. Harris repeated much of the same information, sometimes adding minor details about a scar on Oleg's left hand, or a particular way he folded his cigarettes. Metro stationers and print remained open for several more years, gradually losing business to bigger chain stores and newer shopping centers along the Beltway. Eventually, the narrow storefront on South Glebe Road changed hands. The fluorescent lights came down, the copy machines were hauled away, and the shelves that had once held memo pads and pens were replaced with racks of discounted clothing. The first man was in his early 40s, slim, with thinning brown hair and wire-rimmed glasses. He wore a dark sport coat, despite the summer heat, and carried a small leather briefcase. He bought a legal pad and a pack of black ballpoint pens, paid in cash, and accepted his receipt without looking at it. She picked it up automatically. The top half, the part with the store name and date, was missing. Only the bottom remained, a short strip of thermal paper with the last few digits of a total, a timestamp, and several handwritten numbers in blue ink squeezed into the narrow margin. They weren't phone numbers. They looked more like coordinates or codes. Karen frowned, then shrugged. The first man was gone. On the edge of the same table, in almost the exact spot as before, lay a torn receipt, folded once, white edge peeking out between a stack of pocket notebooks. Karen finished with her customer, walked toward the door, and picked it up. Again, it was only the bottom half. The man unfolded the receipt, glanced at it briefly, then took a small pen from his inner pocket. He wrote something quickly in the narrow margin, folded the receipt into thirds, and set it down on a low shelf beside a stack of memo pads. Then he turned and walked out without looking back. Karen did not move immediately. 2 days later, after a restless night and another conversation with her brother, she made a decision. On September 12th, using a phone booth 2 blocks from the store, Karen called the FBI field office in Washington, D.C. She introduced herself, explained where she worked, and said she had seen something that might be nothing or might not. The ink and handwriting suggested the same person had written on all 3 receipts. The grouping of letters and numbers resembled systems historically used by Soviet intelligence, short code groups that could be mapped against a one-time pad or a reference system. More importantly, the timestamps and patterns matched a basic framework for dead drop signaling. Small, disposable items left in predictable locations at predictable times. 3 minutes later, the younger man with the badge entered, carrying his familiar manila folder. He brushed past the shelf, fingers skimming its edge, and in a single smooth motion, picked up the folded receipt. He continued walking without breaking stride, heading toward the back as if nothing at all had happened. Every movement matched Karen's earlier account. The agents inside the store reported it by radio. Inside his apartment, a search team worked methodically from room to room. In the bedroom closet, beneath a stack of shoeboxes, they found a small metal case containing a compact 35mm camera, a lens, and several rolls of exposed but undeveloped film. In the desk drawer in his living room, they discovered handwritten notes with technical terms, serial numbers, and configuration details that matched, at least broadly, the sort of information Harris would have encountered at his job. But the amounts grew. Payments of $1,000, then $2,000, accompanied each new package of information. Harris insisted his motive had been financial desperation, that he had convinced himself the data was technical and abstract, nothing that would put lives at risk. The torn receipt system at the office supply store had been Oleg's design, implemented after their early meetings had established trust. They produced a short list of possible matches, but none could be conclusively connected to the Arlington operation without more evidence. Reeves and his team concluded that the only realistic chance to identify Oleg was to bait him into resurfacing. In early December, under tight supervision, Harris agreed to participate in a controlled operation. Receipts were left, dead drops were quietly monitored, and the designated signaling sites were watched. No chalk marks appeared on the telephone pole, Harris described. No suspicious figures approached the hidden drop locations. Oleg, whoever he truly was, had either left the area, gone to ground, or been recalled under a different identity. The torn receipt system that had worked smoothly for years had effectively ceased to function. Most customers who had passed through during the critical months of 1981 never learned what had happened there. To them, it was just a place where you bought printer paper and envelopes, another anonymous stop in the landscape of office life orbiting the nation's capital. The torn receipts that had exposed the hidden Soviet spy network were preserved in an evidence file, stored in a cabinet among dozens of other cases where ordinary objects had carried extraordinary meaning.